Miss Marple and the Knitting Club Murder Mystery. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host for tonight, and I'm so happy you're here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from, and how has your day treated you? I always enjoy hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. The Thursday Meeting. The Vicarage Hall in St. Mary Mead possessed that particular quality of cheerful shabbiness that only the best English village institutions can achieve. The floorboards creaked in a manner that was both familiar and oddly comforting, and the two tall windows, though somewhat draughty, looked out upon the churchyard where yew trees stood in perpetual contemplation of mortality and gardening schedules in equal measure. Miss Jane Marple settled herself into one of the worn chairs, arranged in a sociable semicircle before the fire, placing her knitting bag carefully at her feet. She'd been invited to join the Thursday evening knitting club as an honorary member, though she suspected this had more to do with Mrs. Pembury's kind heart than any particular need for additional members. Not that Miss Marple minded. She rather enjoyed the rhythmic click of needles and the gentle murmur of conversation that accompanied such gatherings. The fire crackled pleasantly, sending wavering shadows across the whitewashed walls. It was 7 on a Thursday evening in late October, and outside, the darkness had already settled over the village like a comfortable blanket. "Do come and sit here." "Miss Marple!" called Mrs. Pembury, bustling forward with the air of a woman who found genuine pleasure in organizing others. She was a plump, cheerful person of perhaps 55, with rosy cheeks and bright eyes that seemed always on the verge of discovering something delightful. "I've saved you the chair nearest the fire. One feels the cold more as the evenings draw in, doesn't one?" "How very thoughtful," murmured Miss Marple, allowing herself to be guided to the appointed seat. "You're quite right about the cold. My nephew Raymond always says I ought to move somewhere warmer, but I tell him that St. Mary Mead suits me perfectly." "Quite right, too," declared Mrs. Pembury, settling into her own chair and extracting from her capacious bag a half-completed jumper in cheerful yellow wool. "One's roots matter, I always say. Now then, is everyone present? Mrs. Elliot, good evening. And Maisie, dear, do stop hovering in the doorway. Come and join us properly." Miss Marple observed the two arrivals with a quiet attention she might have given to a particularly interesting passage in her library book. Mrs. Elliot was a tall, angular woman, with iron-gray hair pulled back so severely that it seemed to tighten her already stern expression. She nodded curtly to the assembled company and took her seat with the air of one conferring a favor. "Good evening," she said, her voice as starched as her collar. "I trust we shan't be late this evening. I have matters to attend to at home." Of course," said Mrs. Pembury, her cheerfulness undimmed. "We generally finish by 9, as you know." The young woman who entered behind Mrs. Elliot presented a striking contrast. Maisie Turner could not have been more than 23 or 24, with soft brown hair and the sort of prettiness that might have been quite charming had it not been somewhat dimmed by an air of perpetual anxiety. She clutched her knitting bag to her chest as though it contained something precious and fragile, and her eyes darted nervously around the room before she took the remaining chair. "Good evening, everyone," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Maisie, dear." "You look quite pale," observed Mrs. Pembury with immediate concern. "Are you quite well?" "Oh, yes, quite well, thank you," Maisie replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I've just been rather busy, that's all." Miss Marple, drawing out her own knitting with practiced ease, noticed that Maisie's hands trembled slightly as she opened her bag. "Interesting." The door opened once more to admit the final member of their group. Mrs. Ridgewell swept in with the confidence of one who knows herself to be the possessor of information others do not have. She was a handsome widow of 60, dressed in black that was just fashionable enough to suggest she had not entirely abandoned earthly vanities despite her bereaved state. "My dears, I'm terribly sorry to be late," she announced, settling herself with a rustle of silk. "I was detained by the most extraordinary encounter with the new shopkeeper. You know, the one who's opened that yarn shop in Much Benham. Such a charming man, though one wonders about a gentleman involving himself in such a trade." "A yarn shop?" Mrs. Pembury's face lit up. "How delightful. I hadn't heard." "Oh yes, only opened last week. He has the most beautiful stock, I'm told, cashmere and imported silks." Mrs. Ridgewell extracted her work with a flourish. "I rather think we should plan an expedition, don't you?" For the next half-hour, the conversation flowed as peacefully as the wool through their practiced fingers. Miss Marple worked steadily on a scarf for the church bazaar, saying little but listening to everything. She had long ago discovered that people revealed far more when they believed you were absorbed in your handiwork. Mrs. Pembury proved to be an entertaining organizer, keeping conversation moving pleasantly while her needles worked with impressive speed. Mrs. Elliot contributed occasional sharp observations about village matters, her moral disapproval of various individuals clear in her tone. Maisie said very little, her attention seemingly focused entirely on the complicated pattern she was attempting, though Miss Marple noticed she had to undo the same row 3 times. Mrs. Ridgewell predictably supplied a steady stream of gossip, delivered with just enough hesitation before the juicier details to ensure everyone was paying proper attention. "And of course," Mrs. Ridgewell was saying, "everyone knows that the Hendersons are in terrible financial difficulties. Poor investments, I believe, though one does wonder if it's quite proper to maintain such a large household when one can't afford to pay one's debts. Perhaps we shouldn't speak of such things," said Mrs. Pembury gently, though without any real censure in her voice. Around 8 the vicar's wife brought in tea and biscuits, setting the tray on a small table. Mrs. Pembury poured with her usual efficiency, handing cups around. "Sugar, Miss Marple?" "Just 1 lump, thank you." Miss Marple accepted her cup and returned to her knitting. She noticed that Mrs. Pembury, having distributed tea to everyone else, now sat regarding her own cup with a slight frown. "Is something wrong?" asked Miss Marple quietly. Mrs. Pembury started slightly. "Oh no, nothing really. It's just that the tea tastes rather odd this evening, bitter somehow." She set the cup down without drinking more. "Perhaps the milk was slightly off." "You look rather pale yourself, if I may say so," Miss Marple observed. "Are you feeling quite well?" "Just a slight headache, I think." "Nothing to concern yourself about." Mrs. Pembury smiled, but Miss Marple thought she did indeed look paler than usual. "Now then, has anyone thought about what we might make for the Christmas sale?" The conversation turned to festive preparations, and the moment passed. But Miss Marple, while appearing to focus entirely on her scarf, found her eyes returning thoughtfully to Mrs. Pembury throughout the remainder of the evening. At 9 precisely, Mrs. Elliot announced her departure and the gathering began to break up. Miss Marple gathered her things slowly, watching as Mrs. Pembury tidied the room with automatic movements. "Thank you so much for a pleasant evening," Miss Marple said warmly. "It's always such a pleasure to have you," Mrs. Pembury replied, though her smile seemed to require effort. "I do hope you'll join us again next Thursday. I should be delighted." As Miss Marple made her way home through the quiet village streets, she found herself thinking about the evening. Nothing untoward had occurred. Certainly just a pleasant gathering of village women pursuing their harmless hobby. And yet something had disturbed the evening's peace. However slightly, that bitter tea, Mrs. Pembury's unusual pallor, young Maisie's trembling hands, and Mrs. Pembury's knitting bag, which Miss Marple had glimpsed as she was leaving, its contents in a state of unusual disarray for such a methodical person. Miss Marple let herself into her cottage and set about her evening routine. Very likely it was nothing at all. These little oddities one noticed were usually perfectly innocent. But experience had taught Miss Marple that in villages, as in life, nothing was ever quite as simple as it appeared on the surface. Chapter 2. A dropped-stitch Miss Marple was in her garden the following morning, inspecting the late roses with a critical eye, when she heard the news. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, came hurrying down the path with the sort of agitated haste that immediately suggested something was amiss. "Miss Marple, have you heard?" she called, quite breathless. "It's Mrs. Pembury. She's been found dead." Miss Marple straightened slowly, secateurs in hand. "Dead? But I saw her only last evening." I know. Isn't it dreadful?" Mrs. Hartnell went round this morning to return a book she'd borrowed, and when there was no answer, she looked through the window. Poor Mrs. Pembury was sitting at her table, just as though she'd fallen asleep over her knitting. "How very distressing," said Miss Marple quietly. "Has Dr. Haydock been called?" "Oh, yes, he's there now. He says it was her heart." Mrs. Clement lowered her voice, though they were quite alone in the garden. "Apparently it can happen quite suddenly at her age, though she never mentioned any trouble to me." Miss Marple removed her gardening gloves with deliberate care. "Perhaps I should call. One likes to pay one's respects." "Yes, of course. I'm sure Mrs. Elliot would appreciate the company. She's there now making arrangements." An hour later, Miss Marple presented herself at Mrs. Pembury's cottage, a neat stone building on the far side of the village green. The door stood open, and she could hear voices within. Mrs. Elliot emerged from the sitting room as Miss Marple entered the narrow hallway. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come." Mrs. Elliot's stern features were softened somewhat by genuine grief. "It's a terrible shock. I've known Elena Pembury for 30 years. "Please accept my deepest sympathies," said Miss Marple. "I understand Dr. Haydock has given his opinion. Heart failure, he sees. Quick and painless, which is some comfort." Mrs. Elliot drew herself up. "I'm seeing to things for her. She had no immediate family, a cousin somewhere in Yorkshire, but they weren't close." Through the open door of the sitting room, Miss Marple could see Constable Polk, the village policeman, speaking quietly with Dr. Haydock. The doctor was a brisk, no-nonsense man of 45 who had attended the village for nearly 20 years. "No signs of anything untoward," she heard him say. The heart simply gave out. "It happens." Constable Polk nodded, making notes in his careful manner. "Right you are, doctor. I'll just note the particulars for the record." Miss Marple moved quietly to the doorway. "I'm so sorry to intrude. I just wanted to offer any assistance I might provide." Dr. Haydock turned, his professional expression softening slightly. "Miss Marple, very good of you. I'm afraid there's nothing to be done now. Mrs. Pembury passed away sometime during the night, I should say. Peaceful enough by all appearances." "She seemed quite well last evening," Miss Marple ventured, "though she did mention a headache, and I thought she looked rather pale." "Ah, well. There you are," said Dr. Haydock with the satisfaction of a theory confirmed. "Early symptoms, no doubt. The heart doesn't always give much warning." Miss Marple stepped further into the room. Mrs. Pembury sat in her chair by the table, her head tilted gently to one side, as though she had indeed simply dozed off. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needle still threaded with the cheerful yellow wool from the previous evening. Everything appeared perfectly tranquil, almost everything. "Did anyone touch anything?" Miss Marple asked, her voice carefully casual. Constable Polk looked up from his notebook. "Just Dr. Haydock here. Miss, to verify she'd passed, and Mrs. Hartnell, who discovered it. But she didn't go beyond the window." Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes taking in every detail of the peaceful scene. On the table beside Mrs. Pembury sat a teacup, empty save for a brown stain in the bottom. A plate with 2 biscuits remained untouched. And there, near Mrs. Pembury's elbow, was her knitting bag, the bag that had been in such unusual disarray the previous evening. Now it sat perfectly neat, its contents arranged with the sort of methodical precision Miss Marple knew Mrs. Pembury to possess. The balls of wool were lined up by color, the needles sorted by size, every scissor and stitch marker in its proper place. Did Mrs. Hartnell mention whether the door was locked? Miss Marple inquired. "Locked from the inside, miss?" said Constable Polk. "Had to use Mrs. Pembury's spare key from under the flower pot to get in." "I see. And the windows?" Dr. Haydock gave her a slightly curious look. "All secure as far as I could tell." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason," said Miss Marple mildly. "One simply wonders about these things." But she had noticed something the gentleman apparently had not. The window beside the bookshelf, though closed, had its latch in the open position. It would require only the slightest pressure from outside to push it open, and on the windowsill, barely visible unless one looked closely, was a faint scuff mark in the dust, as though something or someone had disturbed it recently. Mrs. Elliot appeared with a clean sheet. "I thought we might make her more comfortable before the undertaker arrives." "Quite right," said Dr. Haydock. "Well, Miss Marple, unless you have any other questions, I should be getting back to my rounds." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Just one small thing, Doctor. You mentioned Mrs. Pembury's heart failed. Had she complained of any symptoms recently?" "Not to me, she hadn't. But then some people are stoic about such things." "Indeed. And at the knitting club last evening, she mentioned her tea tasted strange. Bitter, she said. Could that be related to a heart condition?" Dr. Haydock frowned slightly. "Bitter taste? Well, possibly. Some cardiac symptoms can affect taste, though it's not common." He paused, then shook his head. "No, I expect the milk was simply off, as you said. We mustn't look for complications where none exist." "No, indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "How very sensible." After the doctor and constable had departed, Miss Marple remained a moment longer, ostensibly to offer comfort to Mrs. Elliot, but in reality to observe the room more carefully. Her eyes moved from the teacup to the knitting bag, from the unlatched window to the peaceful figure in the chair. Everything suggested a natural death, a woman of a certain age, her heart simply stopping during the quiet evening hours. And yet, Mrs. Pembury's knitting bag, chaotic last evening, now perfectly ordered, a window latch left open, that bitter taste she had mentioned, and the fact that she had refused a second cup of tea, something Miss Marple could not recall her ever doing before. Miss Marple took her leave and walked slowly home through the village. The morning sun was bright, birds sang in the hedge, and everything appeared perfectly normal. But appearances, as Miss Marple had learned over many years of quiet observation, could be remarkably deceptive. Chapter 3. The Pattern That Didn't Match 2 days after Mrs. Pembury's funeral. Miss Marple found herself once again at the deceased's cottage. Mrs. Elliot had requested assistance in sorting through her late friend's belongings, a task that required both tact and efficiency. "It's kind of you to help," said Mrs. Elliot, unlocking the front door. "I confess I find it rather overwhelming. Elena was so particular about her things, and I want to be sure everything is dealt with properly." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "One wishes to honor the departed by treating their possessions with respect." The cottage still held that peculiar stillness that follows death, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Mrs. Elliot led the way to the sitting room, where several boxes had been prepared for sorting. "I thought we might begin with her knitting things," Mrs. Elliot said briskly, her natural efficiency reasserting itself now that the initial shock had passed. "There are rather a lot of them, and I know the Church Bazaar Committee would be grateful for any completed items." Miss Marple settled herself at the table and began examining the contents of Mrs. Pembury's workbasket with careful attention. There were several finished pieces, a pair of mittens in soft gray, 2 scarves in cheerful colors, and a delicate lace collar that demonstrated considerable skill. She was an excellent knitter, Miss Marple observed. Oh, yes, quite meticulous, agreed Mrs. Elliot. Everything had to be just so. She'd undo an entire evening's work if she found a single mistake. It was then that Miss Marple drew out the half-finished baby blanket. She held it up to the light. From the window, studying it with the sort of attention another woman might give to a precious jewel. The blanket was perhaps 2/3 complete, worked in a simple but elegant pattern. It was white. Or rather, it should have been white, but it wasn't. The first third of the blanket was worked in a creamy, soft white that had a slightly warm tone to it. The remaining portion, however, was done in a cooler, brighter white that jarred noticeably against the original shade. How odd, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Elliot looked up from the box she was sorting. What is it? This baby blanket. It's worked in 2 different shades of white. Miss Marple turned it over, examining the stitches. The work is identical, so it was certainly made by the same person, but the yarn is completely different. Mrs. Elliot frowned and came to look. How strange. Elena would never have done such a thing deliberately. She was most particular about matching colors. Precisely what I was thinking, said Miss Marple. She located the ball of yarn attached to the needles and examined its label. This is from Harrod's, the shop in Much Benham. That's right. Elena often went there. Miss Marple set down the bright white yarn and searched through the basket until she found another partial ball of the creamy white shade. This label was different, bearing an unfamiliar name printed in elegant script, Llewellyn Fine Yarns. Do you know this shop? Miss Marple asked, showing the label to Mrs. Elliot. Can't say I do. But then I don't knit as much as Elena did. She was always seeking out new suppliers. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, her fingers gently stroking the 2 different yarns. Mrs. Pembury, meticulous Mrs. Pembury, would never have simply grabbed the wrong shade and continued working. Something had caused her to switch yarns mid-project, and it wasn't carelessness. Mrs. Ridgewell mentioned a new yarn shop, Miss Marple said slowly. Didn't she say it had just opened in Much Benham, run by a gentleman? Oh yes, I remember now. She seemed quite taken with the proprietor. Said he was rather charming. Mrs. Elliot's tone suggested she found such charm in a tradesman somewhat suspect. Miss Marple carefully folded the blanket and set it aside. I wonder if this might be the shop. The label does say Much Benham. She continued sorting through the basket, her movements unhurried but thorough. Beneath several balls of yarn and a package of needles, she discovered something else of interest, a receipt, folded small and tucked into a corner. The receipt was from Llewellyn Fine Yarns, dated 3 weeks prior. It listed 1 ball of cashmere blend yarn in white, priced at what Miss Marple considered rather dear for such a small quantity. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that caught her attention. Special order. Handle with care. Handle with care, Miss Marple repeated softly. How curious. What's curious? Mrs. Elliot was back at her own box, sorting through linens. Oh, just a receipt. It seems Mrs. Pembury purchased some rather expensive yarn recently. Cashmere blend. That doesn't sound like Elena. She was careful with her money. Not mean, you understand, but sensible. Miss Marple tucked the receipt into her handbag with a sort of absent gesture that suggested she'd simply forgotten it was there. In truth, she had every intention of examining it more closely later. The 2 women continued their work in companionable silence for another hour. Miss Marple sorted wool by color and type, setting aside the completed items for the bazaar, and organizing the materials that might be useful to other knitters. all. The while, her mind was occupied with the puzzle of the mismatched blanket. Mrs. Pembury had been working on the blanket at the Thursday meeting. Miss Marple distinctly remembered seeing the creamy white yarn. By the time of her death, she had switched to the brighter shade. Why? Had she simply run out of the original yarn? But then why not purchase more of the same shade from the same shop? Unless, of course, there had been a reason she could not or would not return to Llewellyn Fine Yarns. Did Mrs. Pembury mention anything unusual to you recently? Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone casual. Any concerns or worries? Mrs. Elliot paused in her folding. Nothing specific, though now that you mention it, she did seem rather preoccupied the last week or so. I asked if something was troubling her, but she just smiled and said she was thinking about helping someone in need. How charitable of her. Yes, she had a kind heart. Too kind sometimes. People took advantage. Mrs. Elliot's mouth tightened. That Turner girl, for instance, always coming around with some tale of woe, hoping for money. I expect you mean Maisie Turner, the young woman from the knitting club. The very same. I saw them talking quite intently outside the post office just last week. Maisie was crying, and Elena had her hand on the girl's arm. I thought at the time that Elena was being too soft with her. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Did Mrs. Pembury mention what they discussed? No, and I didn't pry. One doesn't. Mrs. Elliot's tone suggested that while one didn't pry, one certainly noticed and drew conclusions. They finished their sorting as the afternoon light began to fade. Miss Marple gathered her things, including several items Mrs. Elliot insisted she take for the church bazaar. The baby blanket, by unspoken agreement, remained in Miss Marple's possession. As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple thought about patterns. In knitting, a pattern was a series of instructions to be followed precisely, each stitch building upon the last to create a coherent whole. But when something disrupted that pattern, when a knitter suddenly switched to a different yarn mid-project, it suggested either carelessness or necessity. And Mrs. Pembury had never been careless. The evening air was growing chill, and Miss Marple drew her shawl closer. Somewhere in this quiet village, there was an answer to the question of why a meticulous woman had suddenly changed her materials. And Miss Marple suspected that answer had something to do with a gentleman shopkeeper and a new yarn shop that sold expensive cashmere to be handled with care. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Much Benham. It was time she met this Mr. Llewellyn for herself. Chapter 4. Tea, Sugar, and Secrets. The following afternoon found Miss Marple taking tea with Mrs. Ridgewell, an invitation that had been extended with that particular insistence which suggested the hostess had information she was eager to impart. Mrs. Ridgewell's sitting room was comfortable in the manner of those who have both taste and the means to indulge it, though a certain fussiness in the arrangement of cushions and ornaments suggested a woman with time on her hands. "So good of you to come, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Ridgewell, pouring from a silver teapot that had clearly seen better days but retained a certain dignity. "One sugar or two?" "Just one." "Thank you." "I find myself quite unsettled by poor Elena's death," Mrs. Ridgewell continued, settling herself with a rustle of black silk. "We weren't intimate friends, you understand, but one knew her for so many years. It leaves a gap in the village." "Indeed it does," agreed Miss Marple, accepting her cup. "She seemed in such good spirits at the knitting club meeting. One never knows, does one?" "One certainly does not." Mrs. Ridgewell leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to that confidential tone that signaled the approach of gossip. "Though I must say, Miss Marple, I've been thinking a great deal about that evening. Didn't you find Elena rather distracted?" "Perhaps a little," Miss Marple said carefully. She mentioned a headache. Yes, but more than that. She kept looking at young Maisie Turner in the oddest way, almost concerned, if you know what I mean, and Maisie herself was in quite a state. Miss Marple sipped her tea, which was excellent. I did notice Miss Turner seemed rather anxious. Anxious? She was practically beside herself. Mrs. Ridgewell selected a biscuit with deliberate care, and I believe I know why. You see, I happened to be in Much Benham the day before the knitting meeting, and I saw Maisie coming out of the bank. She was crying, Miss Marple, actually crying right there on the street. How distressing for her. Well, quite. Naturally, I went to ask if I could be of assistance, but she hurried away without speaking. Most peculiar. Mrs. Ridgewell paused to let this information settle. I mentioned it to Mrs. Bradley at the post office, and she told me something very interesting indeed. Miss Marple waited, knowing that patience was always rewarded in such conversations. It seems young Maisie had applied for a loan at the bank, quite a substantial sum, apparently, but her application was denied. Mrs. Ridgewell's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of one in possession of significant intelligence. Mrs. Bradley heard it from her cousin, who works as a clerk there. Most irregular to discuss such things, of course, but you know how these matters slip out. Indeed, Miss Marple set down her cup. Did Mrs. Bradley happen to know what the loan was for? Ah, well, that's where it becomes rather murky. Something to do with her mother's medical expenses, supposedly. Though, between you and me, Miss Marple, I wonder if it wasn't for something else entirely. These young people get themselves into all sorts of difficulties these days. Perhaps she genuinely needed help for her mother, Miss Marple suggested mildly. Oh, possibly. Mrs. Ridgewell waved a dismissive hand. But here's the truly interesting part. Elena Pembury was seen speaking with Maisie outside the bank that very same day. They stood talking for quite some time, and Elena gave her something. An envelope, Mrs. Bradley thought. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained placidly interested. An envelope indeed, and Elena was heard to say quite distinctly that she would help if she could. Mrs. Ridgewell leaned back, satisfied with the effect of her revelation. Now, you may recall that Elena had recently come into some money, had she? Oh, yes, an inheritance from a distant cousin in Yorkshire. Not a fortune, you understand, but a tidy sum. Several £100, I believe. Elena mentioned it to me some weeks ago, though she was quite modest about it. Said she'd been considering how best to use it for good purposes. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. And you believe she intended to help Miss Turner? Well, it would explain why Maisie was at the knitting meeting looking so distraught, wouldn't it? Perhaps Elena had promised to lend her money, then changed her mind. Or perhaps, Mrs. Ridgewell lowered her voice meaningfully, she discovered something about the girl that made her reconsider. That seems rather speculative, Miss Marple observed. Perhaps. But Elena did say something odd when we were having tea at the vicarage last month. She mentioned that one must be careful about helping people because sometimes one discovers they're not quite what they seem. Mrs. Ridgewell selected another biscuit. I asked what she meant, but she just smiled and changed the subject. Miss Marple considered this as she finished her tea. The picture that was emerging was becoming more complex. Mrs. Pembury with her unexpected inheritance, planning to help someone in need. Maisie Turner, desperate for money, being refused by the bank. A conversation between the two women and an envelope changing hands. And then, at the knitting meeting, Mrs. Pembury watching Maisie with concern while refusing her second cup of tea because it tasted bitter. Did Mrs. Pembury mention anyone else she might help? Or anything that was troubling her? Mrs. Ridgewell paused, teacup halfway to her lips. Now that you mention it, she did seem preoccupied the last time I saw her. That was at church last Sunday. I asked if something was wrong, and she said she'd discovered something rather troubling about someone she'd trusted. I did, she said, but she wouldn't elaborate. Said it wouldn't be Christian to spread tales before she was certain of her facts. How very like her. Yes. Elena always was discreet, almost to a fault. I sometimes thought... Mrs. Ridgewell set down her cup with a decisive clink. But discretion can be taken too far, Miss Marple. If she'd confided her concerns to someone, perhaps she might still be alive. You don't believe it was simply her heart, then? Oh, I'm sure the doctor knows best, Mrs. Ridgewell said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. But one does wonder, doesn't one? Elena seemed perfectly healthy, never complained of any trouble. And then, suddenly, just like that, she's gone. Miss Marple made no reply, merely nodding thoughtfully. After a few more minutes of general conversation, she took her leave, thanking Mrs. Ridgewell for the tea and the company. As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple's mind arranged the information she had gathered like pieces of a puzzle. Money, it seemed, was at the heart of matters. Money needed by Maisie Turner. Money recently acquired by Mrs. Pembury, who had intended to help someone, but had discovered something troubling about a person she'd trusted. And then there was the expensive cashmere yarn from the new shop in Much Benham, handled with care at the request of the charming Mr. Llewellyn. Miss Marple had not lived in villages for 70 years without understanding that money, more than love or hatred, was often at the root of human wickedness. People did desperate things when they needed money, and other people, more calculating, took advantage of those desperate needs. Tomorrow, she resolved once more, she would visit Much Benham. It was time to meet Mr. Llewellyn and see his shop for herself. And perhaps while she was there, she might understand why a meticulous woman like Elena Pembury had suddenly switched yarns in the middle of a baby blanket, and why that yarn needed to be handled with such particular care. Chapter 5. The Yarn Shop Receipt. Much Benham was a market town some 3 miles from St. Mary Mead, larger and more prosperous than the village, but still possessing that particular English character that comes from centuries of settled existence. Miss Marple arrived on the morning bus, carrying her shopping basket and wearing her most innocently pleasant expression. Llewellyn Fine Yarns occupied a narrow shop front on the high street, between a chemist and a tea room. The window display was artfully arranged with skeins of wool in jewel tones draped over what appeared to be antique knitting needles. A small card in elegant script announced, "Purveyor of the finest wools and yarns. Proprietor H. Llewellyn." Miss Marple pushed open the door, which announced her entrance with a gentle chime. The interior was surprisingly spacious, with shelves reaching to the ceiling and laden with wool of every conceivable color and texture. The air held a faint, not unpleasant scent that Miss Marple could not quite identify. Something chemical, perhaps, beneath the smell of lanolin and dye. "Good morning, madam. How may I assist you?" The man who emerged from the back room was perhaps 40, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and the sort of face that might be called distinguished. He wore a well-cut suit that seemed rather fine for a shopkeeper, and his hands, Miss Marple noticed, were remarkably clean for someone who handled wool all day. "Good morning," said Miss Marple with a sweet smile. "What a charming shop. I've only just heard about it from a friend." "How delightful! I do hope your friend was pleased with her purchase." Mr. Llewellyn's manner was smooth, polished, the voice of a gentleman, certainly, though Miss Marple detected something rehearsed in its refinement. "Oh, most pleased." "She mentioned you had some particularly fine cashmere." "Indeed I do. I import it specially. Might I show you?" He led her to a section of shelves where the more expensive yarns were displayed. His movements were graceful, almost studied. Miss Marple had known men like this before, men who had adopted a role and played it with considerable skill. though occasionally the mask slipped. "This is our premium cashmere blend," Mr. Llewellyn said, drawing out a skein of soft gray wool. "Quite popular with the more discerning knitters in the area." Miss Marple touched it lightly. The wool was indeed beautiful, soft as silk. "How lovely. Though I confess I'm looking for white. I'm making a christening shawl for my great niece." "Ah, white. Yes, I have something that might suit." He moved to another shelf and produced a skein of creamy white cashmere. "This is a particularly fine shade, natural white, undyed." "How interesting," said Miss Marple. "I was told you had a brighter white as well." Something flickered across Mr. Llewellyn's face. Too quick to read. "I did carry a brighter shade, but I'm afraid I've sold out. It was rather popular. What a pity. You see, my late friend Mrs. Pembury purchased some recently, and I did so admire it. From St. Mary Mead she was. Perhaps you remember her." The flicker came again, longer this time. Weariness, perhaps. "Mrs. Pembury. Yes, I believe I do recall the name. A pleasant lady, very pleasant indeed. Such a loss to the village." Miss Marple examined the natural white cashmere with apparent absorption. "She died quite suddenly. You know, her heart—" "I'm very sorry to hear that." Mr. Llewellyn's tone was appropriately somber, but Miss Marple thought she detected relief beneath it. "She seemed in good health when she visited the shop." "When was that, if I might ask?" "I'm trying to piece together her final days, you understand. For the memorial." "Oh, I couldn't say exactly. 2 or 3 weeks ago, perhaps." He moved away slightly, straightening some already straight skeins. "I serve so many customers, you understand." "Of course, though I imagine you keep records for your accounts." "Naturally." The word came a bit too quickly. "I wonder if I might see them." You see, Mrs. Pembury kept such meticulous records herself, and I'm helping to sort through her affairs. It would be helpful to know exactly what she purchased. For the estate, you understand. Mr. Llewellyn hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple read volumes. "I'm afraid my record-keeping is somewhat behind. The shop is still quite new, and I've been rather overwhelmed with orders." "How unfortunate. Still, you must have some records. Even a simple purchase book would help." The man's smooth facade showed the slightest crack. "Perhaps if you came back in a few days, I could have the information ready for you." "That's very kind, but I'm here now, and it would save me another journey." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the sweetness. "I'm not as young as I was, and the bus journey is rather tiring." After a moment, Mr. Llewellyn produced a leather-bound book from beneath the counter. "Very well. Let me see what I can find." He opened the book and ran his finger down the entries. Miss Marple positioned herself to observe, her eyes sharp despite their appearance of vague benevolence. "Ah, yes. Here we are. Mrs. E. Pembury, 1 skein of cashmere blend white, purchased 3 weeks ago Monday, and the price, 12 shillings. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Rather dear for a single skein. It's imported cashmere, madam. The quality justifies the cost." But Miss Marple had already noticed something else. Just below Mrs. Pembury's entry, in what appeared to be the same handwriting, was another notation. "Mr. Turner returned item. Same date. How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "I see Miss Turner's name here as well. Maisie Turner from our village." "She returned something?" Mr. Llewellyn closed the book rather firmly. "A common enough occurrence. Customers sometimes change their minds. But on the same day Mrs. Pembury made her purchase. What a coincidence. And the handwriting looks identical. Does it?" I hadn't noticed. His tone had grown decidedly cooler. "Now, unless there's something else I can help you with, I really must attend to my inventory." Miss Marple smiled with perfect innocence. "Of course, you've been most helpful. I believe I will take a skein of the natural white after all. For my great niece, you know, as Mr. Llewellyn wrapped her purchase." Miss Marple contrived to tear a small corner from the brown paper he used, palming it with the ease of long practice. The paper had a particular texture and watermark that might prove useful for comparison. "There we are, madam. That will be 12 shillings. Miss Marple paid and accepted the package. "Such a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Llewellyn. I do hope your business thrives. Though I wonder," she added, as though the thought had just occurred to her. "With Mrs. Pembury gone, you've lost a good customer." "One learns to accept such losses in business," he replied, but his eyes had grown watchful. "Indeed, one does." Miss Marple moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, one more thing. That particular scent in your shop, rather chemical, isn't it? What is it, if you don't mind my asking?" "Mordant," he said after a brief hesitation. "For setting dyes. Quite common in the trade? How interesting. I thought perhaps it was something else. Something one might use for preservation, perhaps." She let the question hang in the air, then smiled. "But I'm sure you know best. Good day, Mr. Llewellyn." As she left the shop, Miss Marple was quite certain of two things. First, that Mr. Llewellyn was not what he appeared to be, and second, that he was considerably more nervous about Mrs. Pembury's death than a mere shopkeeper should be. Chapter 6. The Man. Who waited outside Miss Marple had scarcely returned to St. Mary Mead when fortune presented her with an unexpected piece of information. She had stopped at the post office to collect her mail when young Tommy Barnes, the delivery boy, came wheeling his bicycle through the door with his usual exuberance. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, dumping a sack of parcels on the counter. "Good afternoon, Tommy. How are your mother and sister?" "Right as rain, thank you, miss." He sorted through the parcels with practiced efficiency. "Mum says to thank you for the recipe you sent over. She made the cake yesterday and says it's the best she's ever tasted." "How kind of her to say so." Miss Marple collected her letters, then added casually, "I don't suppose you delivered anything to Mrs. Pembury's cottage the week before she died? I'm trying to establish what correspondence she received for the estate." Tommy scratched his head thoughtfully. "Can't say as I remember any letters, miss. But I did see something odd that Thursday evening, the night before she passed." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Oh, well, I was cycling past her cottage on my way home from a late delivery, must have been around 7 now, and there was a man standing outside her gate, just standing there. Like he was waiting for something." "Can you describe him?" "Tall fellow. He was wearing a brown overcoat and a hat pulled down low. I couldn't see his face proper, on account of it being dusk and all, but he was watching the cottage." "I'm sure of that. Did you see if he went in?" "No, miss. I cycled on past. Didn't think much of it at the time, but now, with Mrs. Pembury dying and all, it does seem a bit peculiar, doesn't it?" Miss Marple agreed that it did indeed seem peculiar. After leaving the post office, she made her way thoughtfully back to her cottage. A man waiting outside Mrs. Pembury's home the evening before her death, the same evening Miss Marple had noticed the unlatched window. She retrieved from her desk drawer the small photograph she had surreptitiously obtained during her visit to Much Benham. It had been displayed in Mr. Llewellyn's shop window, showing the proprietor standing proudly before his shelves of wool. She studied it carefully, noting the man's height. An hour later, Miss Marple had located Tommy Barnes at his home and shown him the photograph without preamble. "Was this the man you saw?" Tommy squinted at the picture, then nodded slowly. "Could be, miss. The height's right and the coat looked similar. Can't say for certain about the face, but I'd wager that's him." Miss Marple thanked him and continued her walk, her mind arranging these new facts alongside the others she'd collected. Mr. Llewellyn had been in St. Mary Mead the evening before Mrs. Pembury's death, waiting outside her cottage. Yet he had claimed barely to remember her when Miss Marple visited his shop. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple examined once more the baby blanket she had kept from Mrs. Pemberry's things. She held the brighter white yarn close to her nose and inhaled carefully. There it was again, that faint chemical scent she had noticed in the shop. But there was something else beneath it, something acrid and unpleasant that made her draw back. She thought about Mrs. Pemberry's cottage and the unlatched window. The door had been locked from inside, Constable Polk had said, but a window latch left open could be manipulated from outside by someone who knew the trick of it. Miss Marple had seen her own Gardner do the same when she had accidentally locked him. Out of her tool shed, the pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not yet a complete one. A knock at her door interrupted these thoughts. It was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, looking somewhat distressed. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to trouble you, but I've just had the oddest conversation with Maisie Turner. She came to the vicarage in quite a state, asking if we knew anything about Mrs. Pemberry's private papers, specifically whether she had left any letters or documents." "How curious." "What did you tell her?" "That Mrs. Elliot had charge of everything, of course, but Maisie seemed most agitated. She said it was very important, something to do with a promise Mrs. Pemberry had made." Mrs. Clement twisted her handkerchief anxiously. "I do hope the poor girl isn't in some kind of trouble." "Perhaps I should speak with her," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Would you?" "I'd be most grateful." She seemed quite desperate. "And you have such a way of getting to the heart of matters." Miss Marple found Maisie Turner at her small lodging house on the outskirts of the village. The young woman answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and the look of someone who had not slept well in days. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting anyone." "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, my dear. Mrs. Clement mentioned you seemed troubled, and I thought perhaps I might help." Maisie hesitated, then stepped back to allow Miss Marple to enter. The room was small but tidy, with evidence of knitting projects scattered about. On the table lay several balls of yarn, and Miss Marple noted with interest that one was the same bright white cashmere from Mrs. Pemberry's blanket. "That's a lovely shade of white," Miss Marple observed, settling herself into the offered chair. Maisie glanced at the yarn, and fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "I shouldn't have taken it. It was wrong of me. But I was so desperate, and it was just lying there in her basket at the meeting, and I thought she wouldn't miss just one ball." "You took it from Mrs. Pemberry's basket at the knitting club?" "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. "I know it was theft, but I couldn't afford to buy any myself. And I'd promised to make a christening shawl for my cousin. Mrs. Pemberry had been so kind, saying she'd lend me money, and then she changed her mind, and I just felt so angry and desperate." "Changed her mind about lending you money?" "She said she would help me with Mother's medical bills. She even gave me a note saying so, in case anything happened to her. But then, just a few days before the knitting meeting, she sent word that she couldn't do it after all. Said she'd discovered something that made her reconsider." Maisie wiped her eyes. "I don't know what she meant. I hadn't done anything wrong." "Do you still have the note she gave you?" "Yes, it's here." Maisie retrieved a folded paper from her pocket. "It says she would help if she could, but warns me about something. I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now." Miss Marple unfolded the note carefully. It was in Mrs. Pemberry's neat handwriting. "Don't trust him. He's not who he says he is." "Do you know who she meant?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No, I thought perhaps she meant the bank manager who denied my loan." "But that doesn't make sense." Maisie's voice broke. "And now she's dead and I'll never know. And I stole from her, and I feel just dreadful about all of it." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "I think Mrs. Pemberry would understand. And I don't believe she was referring to the bank manager at all." Chapter 7. Knitted in the wrong color. The Sighthine's Thursday evening knitting club meeting that week was a subdued affair. Mrs. Pembury's chair remained conspicuously empty, and the women gathered in the vicarage hall with a sense of unease that no amount of cheerful conversation could dispel. Miss Marple arrived with her knitting bag and the half-finished baby blanket she had kept from Mrs. Pembury's belongings. She had a purpose this evening, though she took care to conceal it beneath her usual air of gentle vagueness. Mrs. Elliot presided in Mrs. Pembury's place, though without her predecessor's warmth. Mrs. Ridgewell was in full flow about some scandal involving the butcher's wife, and Maisie Turner sat in the corner, working on what appeared to be a complicated lace pattern with hands that still trembled slightly. "I've brought along this blanket that Mrs. Pembury was working on," Miss Marple announced during a lull in the conversation. "Such a pity to leave it unfinished. I thought perhaps one of us might complete it in her memory." She spread the blanket across her lap, and the mismatched whites were immediately apparent in the lamplight. "How odd," remarked Mrs. Ridgewell. "Elena would never have made such a mistake." "That's what I thought," said Miss Marple, "which makes me wonder if it wasn't a mistake at all, but rather a necessity. Perhaps she ran out of the original yarn." Maisie Turner had gone very pale. Her needles had stopped moving, and she stared at the blanket with an expression Miss Marple could only describe as horrified recognition. "Is something wrong, dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. "That yarn, the bright white, I have some just like it. Do you indeed? How interesting. Where did you acquire it?" The room had gone very quiet. Even Mrs. Ridgewell had stopped her knitting to listen. Maisie's face crumpled. "I took it from Mrs. Pembury's basket at the last meeting we had. I'm so ashamed. I was angry because she'd withdrawn her offer to help me. And when I saw that expensive cashmere just sitting there, I just took a ball. I thought she wouldn't notice one missing with so much wool in her basket." Mrs. Elliot drew herself up. "Maisie Turner, that was theft." "I know." The tears were flowing freely now. "I know it was wrong, but I didn't hurt her. I swear I didn't. I would never have hurt her." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Of course you wouldn't, dear. But I need you to think very carefully. When you took that ball of yarn from her basket, did you notice anything unusual about it?" "Anything at all?" Maisie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "It felt slightly damp. I remember that. And it had a strange smell, sort of bitter and chemical. I thought perhaps it was a new type of dye. Did you use any of it?" "No. When I got home and looked at it properly, I realized it wasn't quite the right shade for what I was making, and the smell put me off. I've just kept it in my basket." "Very wise of you," said Miss Marple quietly. Very wise indeed. Mrs. Ridgewell could contain herself no longer. "Miss Marple, what is this all about? You're speaking as though there's something sinister about a ball of wool." "Perhaps because there is." Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "You see, I believe Mrs. Pembury discovered something troubling about that particular yarn, something that made her suspicious enough to test it." "Test it? However does one test yarn?" "By steeping it in boiling water and observing the result, rather like making tea." Miss Marple paused to let this sink in. "Mrs. Pembury mentioned at our last meeting that her tea tasted bitter, didn't she?" "Strange," she said. "I believe she'd been conducting a little experiment in her kitchen that evening, testing the yarn she had purchased, and I believe what she discovered alarmed her greatly." The room was absolutely silent now. Even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling. "You're suggesting the yarn was poisoned." Mrs. Ridgewell's voice had risen an octave. "I'm suggesting that Mrs. Pembury had reason to believe it might be dangerous enough that she stopped using it and switched to a different yarn from a different shop, and dangerous enough that she wrote a warning note to Maisie." Maisie fumbled in her pocket and produced the note. "This is what she gave me just a few days before she died." I didn't understand what she meant. Miss Marple took the note and read aloud. Don't trust him. He's not who he says he is. Who is him? Demanded Mrs. Elliot. I believe she was referring to Mr. Llewellyn, the proprietor of the New Yarn shop in Much Benham, the shop where she purchased this particular cashmere. Miss Marple touched the bright white yarn. Gently, Mrs. Pembrey was a careful, methodical woman. When she bought expensive yarn, she would have examined it closely, and I believe she noticed something wrong with it, perhaps a peculiar smell or an unusual texture. So she tested it. But why would a shopkeeper sell poisoned yarn? Mrs. Ridgewell looked bewildered. That, said Miss Marple, is precisely what I intend to discover, though I suspect the yarn itself wasn't meant to poison anyone directly. Arsenic compounds were once commonly used in dyes, particularly for certain shades of green and white. They were banned years ago because of the danger, but someone with chemical knowledge might still have access to such substances. Maisie had grown even paler. You mean I've been carrying poison in my basket? Quite possibly, though if you haven't used it or handled it excessively, you should be perfectly safe. The danger comes from prolonged contact, or in Mrs. Pembrey's case, from making it into a concentrated solution. Miss Marple stood, folding the blanket carefully. Maisie, I need you to give me that ball of yarn. Don't touch it directly. Use a cloth or paper to handle it. With shaking hands, Maisie retrieved the yarn from her bag, wrapped it in her handkerchief, and passed it to Miss Marple. There's something else you should know, Maisie said quietly. Mrs. Pembrey came to see me 2 days before she died. She said she had discovered that Mr. Llewellyn wasn't a real wool merchant at all. She'd written to the address on some of his imported labels, and the letters came back marked, "No such company." She said she was going to confront him and demand an explanation. Did she say when she planned to do this? That Thursday evening, the day of our knitting meeting, she said she would visit his shop the next morning if he didn't come to explain himself first. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pattern was becoming clearer. Mrs. Pembrey, suspicious of the yarn, had investigated further. When she discovered Mr. Llewellyn's deception, she'd given him an ultimatum, come and explain, or she would expose him. And someone had come to her cottage that evening. Tommy Barnes had seen a tall man in a brown overcoat waiting outside. The window had been left unlatched, easily opened by someone who knew the trick. Miss Marple, said Mrs. Elliot sharply, if you believe Mrs. Pembrey was murdered, you must go to the police at once. I intend to do precisely that, Miss Marple replied. But first I need to understand exactly how it was done. You see, the door was locked from inside. Dr. Haydock found no signs of violence. To all appearances, Mrs. Pembrey died peacefully in her chair of natural heart failure. Then how could it be murder? That, said Miss Marple, is what the yarn will tell us. Mrs. Pembrey tested it in boiling water, probably intending to drink, the result to see if it produced any ill effects in small doses, but I believe she got more than she bargained for. The concentration of poison was higher than she expected. She looked around at their shocked faces. I'm going to take this yarn to Dr. Haydock tomorrow and ask him to test it properly. If I'm right about what it contains, then we'll know that Mrs. Pembrey didn't die of natural causes at all. She died because she was too clever for her own good, and because she threatened to expose a man who was selling dangerous goods under false pretenses. But surely Mr. Llewellyn didn't intend to kill her? Mrs. Ridgewell protested. Why would he sell poisoned yarn in the first place? I don't believe he intended any immediate harm, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. But a man dealing in banned substances, selling them under the guise of legitimate merchandise, couldn't afford to have his deception exposed. And when Mrs. Pembrey discovered his secret and threatened to reveal it, he had to silence her. She gathered her things and prepared to leave. I suggest you all check your own yarn supplies carefully. If any of you purchased anything from Mr. Llewellyn's shop, handle it with great care until we know more. As Miss Marple walked home through the dark village streets, she reflected on the peculiar nature of the case. A murder committed with the victim's own curiosity as the weapon. Mrs. Pembury had essentially poisoned herself while trying to protect others from danger. But the man who had provided the poison, who had sold deadly yarn to unsuspecting women, bore the responsibility for her death as surely as if he had held the cup to her lips himself. Tomorrow, she would prove it. Chapter 8. The unraveling thread. Miss Marple presented herself at Dr. Haydock's surgery early the following morning, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. The doctor, accustomed to her occasional visits on matters both medical and social, welcomed her with his usual brisk courtesy. "Miss Marple, not feeling unwell, I hope?" "Not at all, doctor, but I wonder if you might examine something for me." "It concerns Mrs. Pembury's death." Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose. "I gave my opinion on that matter. Natural heart failure." "I know you did, but I've discovered something that may change your view." She unwrapped the parcel carefully, revealing the ball of bright white cashmere. "This is yarn that Mrs. Pembury purchased shortly before her death. I believe it may contain arsenic compounds." The doctor's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention. "Arsenic? That's a serious allegation. I'm quite aware of that, but if you'll examine it, I think you'll find I'm correct. Mrs. Pembury tested it herself by steeping it in boiling water. I believe she inadvertently created a concentrated solution and drank enough to cause her death." Dr. Haydock took the yarn and held it to his nose, sniffing cautiously. His face darkened. "There is a peculiar chemical odor. Where did this come from?" "A shop in Much Benham called Llewellyn Fine Yarns. I visited it myself yesterday." The doctor was already moving toward his laboratory bench. "Give me an hour. I have testing equipment here. If there's arsenic present, I'll find it." Miss Marple spent the intervening time walking slowly through Much Benham's High Street. She paused outside Llewellyn Fine Yarns, noting that the shop appeared closed, despite the hour being well past opening time. The window display remained artfully arranged, but something about the stillness suggested abandonment. She was about to return to Dr. Haydock's surgery when she noticed a chemist's shop 2 doors down. On impulse, she entered. The elderly chemist looked up from his work. "Good morning, madam. How may I help you?" "Good morning. I wonder if you know the gentleman who runs the yarn shop, Mr. Llewellyn." The chemist's expression soured. "Know of him, certainly. Can't say I know him personally." Keeps himself to himself. "He mentioned using mordants for setting dyes. Would that be common in his trade?" "Common enough, yes. Though the smell in that shop isn't from any mordant I recognize." The chemist leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I've wondered about that fellow. Moved here suddenly about 2 months ago. Set up shop with expensive stock and no reputation. In the textile trade, reputation is everything. How interesting. You don't happen to know where he came from?" "London, supposedly. But I asked a colleague there about suppliers named Llewellyn, and he'd never heard of any such firm." The chemist shook his head. "Mark my words, there's something not right about that establishment." Miss Marple thanked him and returned to Dr. Haydock's surgery. She found him in his laboratory, his face grim. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The yarn is saturated with an arsenic compound, an old textile dye that was banned decades ago precisely because of cases like this. Anyone working with it extensively, or, God forbid, ingesting a solution made from it, would face serious consequences." "Fatal consequences, potentially, yes, especially if consumed in concentration." He set down his testing vial. "Miss Marple, if Mrs. Pembury made tea from this yarn, she effectively poisoned herself." She was conducting a test. "I believe she suspected something was wrong with the yarn." Then she was more right than she knew. "The concentration here is extraordinarily high. This wasn't accidental contamination. Someone deliberately treated this wool with arsenic dye. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I think it's time we paid another visit to Mr. Llewellyn's shop, with Constable Polk, if you would be so kind as to accompany me. An hour later, the three of them stood before Llewellyn Fine Yarns. Constable Polk, initially skeptical of Miss Marple's theory, had been convinced by Dr. Haydock's findings. He knocked firmly on the locked door. Mr. Llewellyn, please open up. There was no response. After several more attempts, Constable Polk produced a key obtained from the landlord and unlocked the door. The shop was in disarray. Shelves had been hastily emptied, papers scattered across the floor. Mr. Llewellyn had clearly departed in haste. Miss Marple moved carefully through the chaos, her sharp eyes noting every detail. On the counter lay a ledger, apparently abandoned in his flight. This is most illuminating, she murmured. Look here, Constable. These entries show he was selling arsenic-treated wool at premium prices, labeling it as imported cashmere. The profits were substantial. Dr. Haydock examined a packet of powder left on a back shelf. This is arsenic compound, enough here to treat hundreds of skeins. But why? Constable Polk looked bewildered. Why would anyone sell poisoned yarn? Because, said Miss Marple, he was a dismissed chemist who needed money quickly. Arsenic dyes create beautiful, lasting colors. By using banned substances, he could produce cheaper stock and sell it at luxury prices. Most customers would never know the difference. She held up a document that had fallen behind the counter. And here we have the proof. A dismissal letter from a London chemical firm addressed to Martin Hales, dismissed for unauthorized use of dangerous materials. Martin Hales? Constable Polk frowned. Not Llewellyn? False name, obviously. And look at this. Miss Marple produced the corner of receipt paper she had taken from the shop. The handwriting matches the entries in Mrs. Pembury's purchase book and Maisie Turner's return notation. He wrote both. I suspect Miss Turner never returned anything at all. He created that entry to suggest she had been in the shop, perhaps to cast suspicion on her if questions arose. Dr. Haydock was examining more of the stock. These cashmere labels are forged. The companies they claim to be from don't exist. Mrs. Pembury discovered that, said Miss Marple. She wrote to the addresses and received no reply. When she confronted him with her suspicions, he realized she would expose his entire operation. So he came to her cottage that evening, knowing she planned to test the yarn. Perhaps he hoped to retrieve it before she could prove anything. But the door was locked from inside. Constable Polk objected. The window wasn't. I noticed it was unlatched when I visited. A simple matter to open it from outside if one knows how. I believe he entered through the window, saw that Mrs. Pembury had already prepared her test solution, and simply waited. She would poison herself, and it would appear to be natural heart failure. She paused, her expression sad. He tangled his own rather neatly, as one might say. His attempt to silence Mrs. Pembury has only ensured his exposure. Constable Polk was already moving toward the door. I'll telephone the police in Much Benham. We need to find this Hales fellow before he gets too far. Chapter 9. A Scar for the Guilty. The arrest of Martin Hales, alias H. Llewellyn, occurred with considerably less drama than one might have expected from sensational fiction, but with all the satisfying completeness that truth provides. He was apprehended at the railway station in Much Benham late that same afternoon, attempting to board the London train with a single suitcase. When the police examined its contents, they found it packed with skeins of the expensive cashmere, all treated with the same deadly arsenic compound that had killed Mrs. Pembury. Miss Marple learned these details 2 days later when Inspector Slack of the county police arrived in St. Mary Mead to take formal statements. He was a man who did not naturally incline toward acknowledging the assistance of elderly ladies in criminal investigations, but even he could not deny the facts of the case. You were quite right. "Miss Marple," he said stiffly, seated in her small parlor. The yarn was saturated with arsenic dye. "Hales has confessed to manufacturing it, though he insists he never intended to harm anyone." "I'm sure he didn't," Miss Marple said mildly, pouring tea. "At least not directly. He simply didn't care whether anyone was harmed, which amounts to much the same thing morally, if not legally." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. According to his statement, he was dismissed from his position at a London chemical firm 18 months ago for unauthorized experiments with banned substances. He'd accumulated substantial debts and saw an opportunity to profit from his knowledge of obsolete dye processes. "How very enterprising of him," murmured Miss Marple. "And criminally negligent." "Quite so. He set up the shop in Much Benham, purchased cheap wool stock, treated it with arsenic dye to achieve certain desirable colors and textures, then sold it as imported luxury goods at inflated prices." The inspector's tone suggested grudging admiration for the scheme's ingenuity. "Most of his customers never suspected a thing, but Mrs. Pembury did. Yes, she noticed the peculiar smell and texture. Being a careful woman, she decided to test it before using it for a baby blanket. She steeped a portion in boiling water, as one might do to check color fastness." Inspector Slack's expression grew somber. What she didn't realize was that the process would create a highly concentrated arsenic solution. She apparently tasted it to see if it had any adverse effects. Miss Marple set down her teacup. "And it did. The medical examiner confirms that she ingested enough arsenic to cause heart failure within hours. It would have seemed entirely natural, as indeed we all believed it to be." "Until the pattern emerged," Miss Marple said quietly, "though I confess I was slow to see it at first. The unlatched window troubled me, and the fact that her knitting bag had been disturbed and then tidied again, but it was the mismatched yarn in the baby blanket that truly revealed the truth." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Hales admits he came to her cottage that Thursday evening. Mrs. Pembury had written to him stating she had discovered his imports were fraudulent and that the yarn was dangerous. She demanded an explanation and threatened to report him to the authorities if he couldn't provide proper documentation. So he went to her cottage to plead his case, or perhaps to threaten her into silence. According to his testimony, he intended to reason with her. He waited outside until he saw her lights go out, in the sitting room around 9 Mile. He knew about the window latch because he'd delivered a special order to her weeks earlier and had noticed how easily it could be opened from outside. Miss Marple nodded. He let himself in through the window. He did, but when he entered, he found Mrs. Pembury already dead in her chair. She'd apparently conducted her test that evening, drunk some of the solution, and succumbed to its effects. Inspector Slack consulted his notes again. Hales panicked. He realized that if her death was investigated, the poisoned yarn would be discovered and traced back to him. So he attempted to stage the scene. He tidied her knitting basket, Miss Marple said, made it look orderly and normal as Mrs. Pembury would have kept it. He hoped that if everything appeared peaceful, no one would question the doctor's verdict of natural causes. Precisely. He also disposed of the test solution she'd made, washing the pot thoroughly. Then he left through the window, relatching it from outside, or so he thought. Apparently, he was less successful with that than he believed. The latch was in the open position when I examined it, Miss Marple confirmed. A small detail, but significant. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. He also admits to creating the false entry in his purchase book, suggesting Maisie Turner had returned an item. He hoped that if suspicions were raised, attention might fall on the girl who had financial troubles and had been seen arguing with the deceased. How very unscrupulous. Miss Marple's tone was severe. To cast suspicion on an innocent young woman. Quite, though, in the event, his attempts to cover his tracks merely drew more attention to the circumstances. Had he simply fled when he discovered Mrs. Pembury dead? We might never have known the truth, but he couldn't resist tidying up, and that very tidying betrayed him. Criminals so often do overreach, Miss Marple observed. They can't bear to leave things to chance. They must arrange and control, and in doing so, they create the very patterns that expose them. Well, he'll have years in prison to contemplate his mistakes. The charges are manslaughter at minimum, possibly murder, depending on how the prosecution frames his knowledge of the yarn's dangers and his failure to warn customers. There's also fraud, sale of dangerous goods, and a host of other offenses. After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her parlor, thinking about Elena Pembury, a kind woman, methodical and careful, who had died because she'd been too conscientious for her own good. She had tested the yarn to protect others, never imagining the concentration would be lethal. The following day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Maisie Turner. She found the young woman considerably more composed, though still pale and shaken by recent events. "I can't stop thinking that if I hadn't stolen that yarn, you might never have discovered the truth," Maisie said. "It seems wrong that my theft should have led to something good." "I wouldn't say it led to something good," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But it did lead to justice, which is not quite the same thing, but is important nonetheless. Mrs. Pembury would have wanted the truth known, I think. She was kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it." Maisie's eyes filled with tears. "She tried to warn me about Mr. Llewellyn or Hales or whatever his real name is. If only I'd understood what she meant." "You weren't to know, dear. None of us were, until we looked closely at the pattern." Miss Marple stood to leave. "Now then, you must put this behind you and move forward. Your mother needs you well and strong." As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple reflected that murder, like knitting, was indeed a matter of following patterns. The false stitch always revealed itself eventually, to those patient enough to examine the work carefully. Martin Hales had created an elaborate pattern of deception, but like all such patterns, it had contained the seeds of its own. Unraveling, one needed only to look closely enough to see where the threads didn't quite match. Chapter 10. The Pattern Complete. 3 weeks after Martin Hales was remanded in custody to await trial, the Thursday evening knitting club resumed its meetings at the vicarage hall. The gathering had been postponed out of respect for Mrs. Pembury's memory, but as Mrs. Clement gently pointed out, Elena herself would have wanted them to continue. Miss Marple arrived punctually at 7, her knitting bag in hand. The fire had been lit against the November chill, and the familiar chairs were arranged in their accustomed semicircle. But there was a difference this time, one that every woman present felt acutely. The empty chair by the hearth that had been Mrs. Pembury's usual place. Mrs. Elliot had assumed the role of organizer, though her stern efficiency lacked the warmth that had characterized her predecessor's approach. Mrs. Ridgewell was present, somewhat subdued for once, her usual stream of gossip tempered by recent events, and Maisie Turner sat quietly in her corner, working on a project with the focused attention of someone determined to prove her worth. "Shall we begin?" Mrs. Elliot said, settling herself with her knitting. "I thought we might discuss our contributions for the Christmas bazaar." The conversation flowed more slowly than it had in Mrs. Pembury's time, with longer pauses and a certain careful quality to the remarks. Everyone was conscious of the tragedy that had touched their small group, and the knowledge that murder had come so close to their peaceful Thursday evenings. Miss Marple worked steadily on her scarf, the needles clicking with their reassuring rhythm. She had chosen a soft blue wool, nothing expensive or exotic, just good. Honest yarn from a reputable supplier whose stock contained nothing more dangerous than lanolin. "I understand they found over 50 skeins of poisoned wool in Hales's suitcase," Mrs. Ridgewell ventured after a while. "All of it treated with that dreadful arsenic compound." To think we might have purchased it ourselves." "Indeed," said Mrs. Elliot crisply. "It doesn't bear thinking about." Though I must say, Elena was always more adventurous in her purchasing than I approved. One should stick to established suppliers. Elena was trying to support a new business, Miss Marple said mildly. One can hardly fault her charitable instincts. Charitable instincts can be dangerous, Mrs. Elliot replied. As we've seen. I don't think her instincts were at fault, Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. Her caution rather was admirable. She suspected something was wrong with the yarn, and instead of simply discarding it or ignoring her concerns, she investigated. That took considerable courage. Maisie looked up from her work. She tried to warn me as well if I'd only understood what she meant about not trusting him. You weren't to know, dear. Mr. Hales, or Mr. Llewellyn as we knew him, was very convincing in his role. He'd studied the trade carefully, knew all the proper terminology, presented himself as a gentleman enthusiast. Even an experienced knitter might have been taken in. I was certainly impressed by his manner, Mrs. Ridgewell admitted. So polished and well-spoken. One would never have suspected him of being a dismissed chemist with criminal intentions. That's often the way of it, Miss Marple observed, her needles never pausing. The most dangerous people are frequently those who appear most respectable. They understand that we judge by surfaces, and they learn to present an attractive surface while concealing what lies beneath. Mrs. Elliot sniffed. Well, he'll have years in prison to regret his deceptions. Inspector Slack told me they're pursuing multiple charges: manslaughter, fraud, endangering public safety. The list is quite extensive. And thoroughly deserved, added Mrs. Ridgewell. Though I must say, Miss Marple, we're all grateful for your cleverness in uncovering the truth. If you hadn't noticed that mismatched yarn and pursued the matter, poor Elena's death would have been recorded as natural causes, and that dreadful man might have continued selling his poisoned goods. Miss Marple smiled slightly. I'm not sure cleverness is the right word. Observation, perhaps, and a certain stubbornness about accepting the obvious explanation when small details don't quite fit the pattern. The unlatched window, Maisie said softly. That was one of the things that troubled you, wasn't it? Indeed it was. Mrs. Pembury was a careful woman. She wouldn't have left a window unlatched, particularly not on a chilly October evening. And then there was her knitting basket. So unusually disordered at the meeting, yet perfectly neat when I saw it at her cottage. Someone had tidied it after her death. Hales, trying to make everything appear normal, Mrs. Elliot said. Precisely. But in his anxiety to remove any suggestion of foul play, he created an anomaly. Mrs. Pembury would have tidied her own basket before retiring for the evening. Yes, but she would never have left that half-finished blanket with mismatched yarn. She would have corrected it or set it aside to be undone. The fact that it remained as it was suggested she'd been interrupted by something final and unexpected. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the whitewashed walls. Outside, the November darkness pressed against the windows, but inside the hall was warm and bright. After a pause, Maisie spoke again, her voice hesitant. Miss Marple, I finished the baby blanket, the one Mrs. Pembury started. I unpicked all the poisoned yarn and redid it with safe wool from Mrs. Elliot's shop. I thought I might donate it to the church orphanage in Mrs. Pembury's memory, if that would be appropriate. I think that would be very appropriate indeed, Miss Marple said warmly. Mrs. Pembury would have been pleased. She was making it for the orphanage anyway, Maisie explained to the others. Mrs. Clement mentioned it to me. Elena did so much for charity, always so quietly that hardly anyone knew. That was her way, Mrs. Elliot said, and for once her stern expression softened. She believed in doing good without fuss or recognition. I shall miss her more than I can say. A comfortable silence fell over the group, broken only by the clicking of needles and the occasional shift of someone adjusting their position in the firelight. It was the sort of companionable quiet that comes when people have shared something significant and need no words to acknowledge it. After a while, the vicar's wife brought in tea and biscuits. The cups were distributed, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of that last Thursday meeting when Mrs. Pemberry had refused her second cup because it tasted strange. She had been so close to understanding the danger then, had literally tasted the poison that would kill her. Yet even in those final hours, she had thought not of herself, but of warning others, particularly young Maisie, about the man who was not what he seemed. Murder? Like knitting follows a pattern, Miss Marple said suddenly, speaking her thoughts aloud. Each stitch builds upon the last, and the whole is created through repetition and consistency. But if one looks closely enough, one always sees where the false stitch lies, the thread that doesn't quite match, the tension that's slightly wrong, the place where the pattern was interrupted and resumed with a different hand. Mrs. Ridgewell looked up. You make it sound almost mathematical. Human nature is mathematical in its own way, Miss Marple replied. People are remarkably consistent in their behaviors, their motivations, their methods. Once you understand the pattern of a person's character, their actions become quite predictable. And Hales's pattern was greed, Mrs. Elliot said flatly. Greed, yes, but also desperation. A man who had fallen from his position and was determined to regain it by any means available, regardless of the cost to others. Such people are dangerous precisely because they've convinced themselves that their needs justify any action. The evening continued peacefully, the conversation turning to lighter matters, plans for Christmas, news of families and friends. The empty chair remained by the hearth, a quiet reminder of absence. But the gathering itself had regained its sense of purpose and comfort. As the church clock struck 9, the women began to gather their things. Miss Marple packed away her knitting slowly, watching as Maisie carefully folded the completed baby blanket and placed it in a paper bag. It's beautiful work, dear, Miss Marple told her. Mrs. Pemberry would have been proud. I hope so, Maisie said quietly. I owe her so much. Not just the warning about Hales, but her kindness in general. I won't forget it. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet village streets, her knitting bag over her arm. The November night was cold but clear, with stars visible between the branches of the trees. Lights glowed in cottage windows, and somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. She let herself into her own cottage and prepared for bed with her usual methodical routine. Before retiring, she stood for a moment looking out at the darkened village, thinking about patterns and people, about the threads that connected lives and the stitches that sometimes went wrong. Murder had come to St. Mary Mead, as it had before, and doubtless would again, but justice had prevailed, and the pattern was complete. The false thread had been found and removed, and life could continue its familiar, comfortable course. Miss Marple smiled slightly as she drew the curtains and turned away from the window. Tomorrow she would begin a new scarf, a simple pattern in cheerful colors. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous, just good, honest knitting to warm someone against the winter cold. And that, she reflected as she climbed the stairs to bed, was exactly as it should be.